All right. Well, let's get started. Welcome everybody to One Course Discourse presented by the Beartooth. Today, our topic is education, the high cost of education, and what we're going to do about it. A little bit about me. I'm going to be the MC today, and I worked with Mike Jipping, the special events coordinator here at the Beartooth, to start this kind of format of community engagement, to have the theater open in the daytime to talk about important topics like this. And it's been a good experience and a good way to interact and talk about important issues. So thanks everybody for attending. You know, like many in the room, education has affected me personally. Not only have I attended, 2 universities, including UAA, but I have student loan debt, and also I helped advocate for the Postsecondary scholarship plan that was passed, that I think we'll talk a little bit about today. So, look forward to a good discussion. Our panel, we have. Change my page here. Tracy Stewart, Alaska Pacific University. She's the academic dean there. We're joined by Dr. Heather Ryan, the Dean of Education at the University of Alaska Anchorage. We have Rebecca Matrasova. She's the Director of Outreach and Early Awareness at the Alaska Commission on Postsecondary Education. And we're also joined by U.S. Senator Mark Begich, who helped organize this event. So if everybody could welcome our panelists with me. And I also want to note that we have the UAA student body president in attendance, Drew Lemish. Drew, if you could raise your hand. All right. So the format today, we're going to just take a few minutes to go through, do basic introductions about how these folks here interact with the issue of education. So, and then we're going to open it up for questions. I'll have a few questions, and I want everybody to keep track of what's being said and to make sure to ask questions as well. We have Greer Geller. Greer, if you could stand. Greer is the Constituent Services Director with Senator Mark Begich. She's going to be passing the microphone around, so make sure to flag her if you have any questions. So with that, let's start with you, Tracy, if you can give an introduction and talk to us a little bit about how you work on the issue of education.
Is this working? Oh, it is. Good. Well, thank you very much. I want to thank the Senator for creating this opportunity and the Beartooth and Moose's Tooth for hosting this. It's always a great opportunity to speak to communities. My job at APU is twofold. One of my jobs is to ensure that the academic quality is as best as it can be, and to provide an opportunity as the only private higher education institution in the state to give students choices. You know, the UA system is a marvelous, amazing choice, and I've worked with Heather before, and she's been very helpful on some issues that we've had to address across our campuses. But we teach somewhat differently, much smaller classes, much more student-centered learning. Not that private institutions don't hold that as the only thing that they do, but what we are able to do is create a different level of engagement for students with faculty members, with research, with the way that they're able to translate that research into internships and then jobs. And so it's something that we think we do particularly well. The other hat, though, that I wear at the university is one very related to this topic, which is enrollment management. And what do we do to find students where private higher education is the model that will work best for their learning, and how to make it as affordable as possible. So I don't know, where the conversation is going to go, but one of the things that we've done at APU is we're doing a tuition reset, 33% reduction in our tuition, which will be happening starting fall of 14, and looking at ways to try and increase affordability of higher ed. It doesn't change our bottom line on what it costs to teach a student, but we work to make up the difference with private donations and use of our endowment properties, which create revenue that allow us to continue to educate in a smaller format with less resources. So hopefully that's a good enough start. Heather?
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here too. I participate in these at the University of Regina, where I left earlier this year. and they're very important for the public to have a chance to actually challenge ideas, question. So I do appreciate the opportunity. Thank you very much, Senator Begich. UAA's College of Education is going through a serious rethink right along, as Tracy said, with theirs. We are trying to expand our programming and our outreach to the rural villages in a really serious way. We're working to put field experience students now, and I come from the Canadian system, as you probably hear by the voice, and I believe that students need to be in classrooms from the first time they start into the College of Education. So we will have students going out in year 1, 2, 3, and 4 in the undergraduate degrees. We have presently an MAT, and I'm working very hard right now and already have a draft in place for a post-baccalaureate. An MAT, as I was explaining to Drew a while ago, is a terminal degree. It doesn't, if you wanted to go on to become an academic or work in government or many agencies where advanced degrees matter, you would need to go back and do another master's. So I am presuming, I'm instead trying to place a post-bac which will ladder 15 credits right into a Master's of Education and then on into a PhD. And you will learn to do research, and it will be research-centered with thesis and so on involved, or a project, or perhaps if you were in counseling, a practicum. But the outreach to the communities is a major focus for us right now, and it's starting to happen. Even though we know that money is being cut back, and I'm sure Mark will talk about this, I'm kind of separating pockets of money to support students going out. Because if we want people to stay in Alaska to do their studies, and we want them to stay in the villages to teach, we have to let them know what that means and properly prepare them. So there's a huge amount of effort going into making the programs that we offer very culturally responsive. And we have centered, some of you may or may already be aware of the Center for Research in Alaska Native Education. We have just got it up and running, and it will have grad students going all over the state with the members, the director from there, to look at issues in the communities, look at how education can better be informed by the work of these students. So it's called CRANE for short. Its logo is a crane, surprise that, huh? And you'll see them in the press quite a bit in the near future. So thank you very much.
All right, well, I also want to thank my fellow panelists, and especially Senator Begich, for the opportunity to be here, and thank you for taking the time to come and participate in this discussion. At the Alaska Commission on Postsecondary Education, our mission is to increase access to and success in any type of education and training beyond high school. We provide services around consumer protection, financial aid, the state financial aid programs such as the state supplemental education loans. We also provide the administration for the Alaska Performance Scholarship. All right, thank you. Thank you for that tip. Is that an improvement? Right on topic, as I start speaking about the Alaska Performance Scholarship, which I'm sure is a program that's of interest. It's fairly new. Many students have already been able to take advantage of that opportunity. And then the Alaska Education Grant, the state's need-based program, which has recently seen a fairly substantial increase in funding available to students. As Director of Outreach, I work in the Anchorage office with a great team of staff that's dedicated to education planning, career planning, and the research process that goes into making sure that when you do pursue education and training after high school, you're doing it in a way that's going to get you the most bang for your buck, so that you have an understanding of the financial aid resources that are available to you, that you understand the sort of cost-benefit analysis that does need to go into that. Higher education absolutely pays off, but you do need to do the research, identify a career field, do the math on what your potential expected earnings might be and how that compares to what you want to support as a future lifestyle, especially if you're going to be using debt to support that education. So it's an important process to go through. And we have a great team of staff available actually here in Anchorage to provide support to that, and outreach services that go across the entire state as well to encourage college and career planning specifically.
Thank you very much, Nick. Nick, thank you for emceeing us today and maybe hopefully keeping us on track. I don't know. We'll see. You've added a politician to it, so I think it goes who knows where. But let me say a couple things. Great resources here for folks. I know for 7 years I chaired the Student Loan Corporation, the Postsecondary Education Commission. In fact, I was on the Board of Regents for a year. Come from a family of educators. Education is 2 sisters that are educators, a sister-in-law that just retired from education. So we're wrapped around it, engaged in it. And then on a personal level. On a policy level, there's several things happening on the federal end that people should be aware of. First off, I think the most staggering statistic now that's in front of us is it used to be credit card debt was the big burden that individuals had. Today, it's student loan debt and continuing to increase. I had a forum that I held in Washington, D.C. with business leaders from around the country, about a dozen or so of them, pretty well-to-do folks. This one individual was Jim Cook, who owns Samuel Adams Beer, a good place to talk about beer, but here. He was what he called one of the lucky ones back when he was going to school. He was selected to go to Harvard. He wasn't from any of the prep schools. He called himself a misfit, that he was lucky he got through the door at Harvard, but he was one of the 20% that they allowed in. And he remembers that he could work for minimum wage in the summer and pay for his tuition for Harvard. Today, his daughter, who's going to Harvard, will have to work 10 years to just pay for 1 year of tuition, not including all the other things that are required. It's an amazing shift that has occurred, and the ability that it's making it far out of reach for so many. And then on top of that, the data point I gave you on how much debt is now being accumulated from individuals is continuing to grow very fast. And the issue that Rebecca said is very interesting, and that is, as you look at what kind of college degree you want, or what kind of education you want, what career field, not always do people match them up properly. In other words, they may get a great education, very expensive, but not pick the field that actually helps pay for it. And so it's very important how you think about the future. But on top of that, talking about just kind of where you are today, what you look at in the future, but what do we do today? There's several bills in Washington, D.C. that I have sponsored. Well, one is with Elizabeth Warren. She has worked on a bill, and this is a little bit radical, but we think it's a fair discussion point, and that is, if you kind of simplified it, during the great crash that occurred here in the last 4 or 5 years, the recession we went through, banks were able to borrow at about 20.25, 1/4%. That was their rate that they could borrow at. But if you're a student, I don't know what your current rates are, but they're not at 1/4%, I guarantee you that. But our point was that they should be, if we can loan to banks, who we ended up bailing out at the end of the day, you can borrow a car loan at almost nothing today, which depreciates the minute you buy it, versus an education which only appreciates the value in the case of the individual. It seems we have our priorities a little mixed up. And so on one bill, we're trying to lower that rate for future loans. We've also, which is good, yeah. The other one, which is another piece we're working on, it's not finalized yet, and this is restructuring the debt that people have. And this is a challenge, because it'll be a challenge to the Student Loan Corporation of how we partner with them to make sure they don't get into trouble in the sense of how much refinancing we do, because that's part of your business. But right now you have private loans, government loans, ranges are all over the place, and we have proposed a draft piece of legislation to let people refinance those loans at a 4% rate, because we know if you can shrink that rate, it frees up money out into the economy. The challenge is, for our state, and you can probably add to this, the Student Loan Corporation works off of bonds. They sell to the market, they bring money in, and if those bond rates are higher than 4, they can't loan at that rate. So we got to make sure we're working in tandem, but we do have to refinance this debt. It's just too much people are carrying, and it's preventing them, especially first-time homeowners, to buy their first home, because this debt is now showing up at a pretty aggressive number. On top of that, the last thing I'll mention is we've had some bills on the federal loans. We've brought now the federal loans in-house, and we've also now have pieces of legislation to cap those loans, at least at a certain rate structure, so we don't end up getting people into a huge burden again. But it's a big challenge, $1.2 to $1.4 trillion worth of debt in student loan debt now. And if we don't figure out how to refinance it, restructure it, help the colleges, universities, career education, be able to create affordability, and then making sure that local loaning agencies like the state of Alaska has capacity, we will never solve this problem. So it's a great topic, and thank you for your willingness to do this. Thanks to the panel for willing to be here today. Thanks.
Thank you, Senator. Could we get the microphone to Drew here? Drew, I'd like you to just introduce yourself and just talk about the issue of student loans and the cost of college from your perspective.
So I'm the president of the student body, and in the last year, tuition at UA has gone up, so every year we're paying more, or investing more in our future. And trying to look at it as an expense, or trying not to look at it as an expense but an investment is really hard when the numbers keep going up, I think. Especially when state funding for schools keeps going down. And then the way loans work is a lot of times hard to understand for students. I think the way UAA goes about explaining loans is really vague and not informative enough. So I think that's something that we could work on with the Alaska Commission on Postsecondary Education, and they're really great at explaining that and working with students, I think. So just getting that information out there more. So this year I had to look at UAA, or college, it's also a business, and so tuition is going to continue going up until we plateau and can't pay anymore. The numbers start going down. But if enrollment numbers keep going up, tuition is going to keep going up, I think. That's
Great. No, that's great. I just wanted to give you a chance to introduce yourself. At this time, we've heard from our panelists. I want to make sure to cover as many questions as we can from the audience. Does anybody have any comments or questions at this time?
Thank you. My name is Mike. My name is Mike Perry. Yeah, the cost of education keeps going up, and people are incurring debt right now. But education has always been expensive. Okay, back in 1974, a friend of mine went to college at University of Maryland, and he was working in a village sub shop to pay for his college debt. I saw him on his last night there. He was quitting, and the next day he was going to start as a garbage man to pay off his debt, because back then the garbage men in Baltimore made $25 an hour. So in 1 year he expected to have his debt paid off. This is what we need to do now, okay, with education. I allowed the college is going to drop the tuition by 33%. Excellent, you can't beat that. But do any of you have any idea how we can put the responsibility back on the individual? Paid for my education. Okay, my son is racked up student loans, but he lived like a king while he was in college, okay? And this happens all too often. Okay, the tuition, when you look at it, it's to say, but the cost of living and everything is not that much more than it was back then. So, do you have any ideas on how we can put the responsibility back on the students?
I'll just give 2 seconds on
Yep.
it, and I think one of the programs you guys do, which is the whole idea that I know the Post-Secondary Education Commission does, but others do across the country. I know the universities do it too, and the college, and that is young people need to understand what this debt means. And a lot of times it's almost like divorced from what this debt means, because you're not paying it, you know, you're getting a loan, then you're going to school. And part of our challenge is to make sure people understand clearly, when you borrow this money, here's what it's going to do. First off, the ability to discharge in a bankruptcy doesn't occur when you go through these processes. Credit card debt, which also combines with students, because there are students who will borrow some money and then they'll use their credit card. So it's a combination. Now, one thing we've done on credit cards, just so you know, was the law we passed a couple of years ago, the Dodd-Frank bill, puts a lot more consumer issues on the table than ever before. But the challenge is, you know, you want people to have personal responsibility. You encourage them through education, but the individual has to take the role on. That doesn't always occur, but I know the programs they're doing does have some impact. I don't know if we want to.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, if you want to add really briefly, Rebecca, then we have another question over here. Oh, no, I just flagging the next question person. So go ahead.
Are
So certainly Senator Begich is absolutely correct. One of the most important things that we can do around that is educating students around how to finance an education, making sure that they're taking advantage of non-loan aid whenever they can. We still encounter students who don't actually file the free application for federal student aid, or they do it, so late in the process that they can't be considered for some of the scholarship and grant aid that would be available to them. So that's an important step that we focus a lot of our outreach efforts on. The other piece, and I alluded to this earlier, is understanding the return on investment of that education loan, making sure that you have a career picked, making sure, or at least a major that gives you a general idea of the type of career that you could pursue, making sure that you're dedicating yourself full-time to your education and really making it a priority so that you actually improve your odds of completing that degree and earning a credential that's going to help you earn the income that will allow you to repay your debt. And doing your research on individual loans. The federal loans right now, for example, the federal Stafford has a very competitive rate. It's especially the subsidized federal Stafford loan is a great deal for students. Certainly the rates are lower now than they have been in the past, and unfortunately I haven't had the opportunity to study the proposal that you were speaking of in great depth. But beyond that, many students go to supplemental loans, and at that point, the research really becomes critical. Do students understand the difference between a fixed and a variable rate? Have they done the math to see what the payment is going to be? And we do a lot of education around that as well. Actually, we have in the audience the author of a series of videos that we have available at the ACPE website. Christina, can you wave at us over there? So we've recently developed a series of videos in collaboration with staff at Alaska institutions and with Alaska students to talk about, all right, how do we help get the message across about keeping your education costs low? For example, by choosing what type of lifestyle you're going to have while in college. How do we talk to students about keeping loan costs low and making sure that you do understand the type of commitment you're making? And we've gotten some positive feedback on that, so that's just one of many things that we're doing at the moment to try to make sure that students understand and can really maximize the benefit that they're getting out of their education and come out ahead. I'm a graduate of UAA myself, and I graduated with student loans. I'm still paying them off. I will be for a while, but it was worth it. It was absolutely worth it, and the benefits that it has afforded me in my professional life and in my personal life. I'm a big believer in education beyond high school, whether you do have to take on some debt to finance that or not. The most important thing is doing it the smart way.
Thank you. Good question. So, next up.
So I'm thrilled that we are talking about financial literacy because I think it's incredibly important, and I also think it's important that we consider implementing it earlier than at the college level and possibly at the K through 12 level so that students are financially literate by the time they get to UAA or APU. Personally, I made the same mistakes that Rebecca made, not mistakes, but when I was in college, I did make mistakes. I overborrowed. I'll also be paying off my student loans forever. Currently, I am the director of the Student Financial Assistance Office at UAA. It's a tough job, but I love my job because every day I have an opportunity to prevent a student from making one of the mistakes that I made. I would love to be able to devote more time to the issues that Drew mentioned, like removing some of the vagueness around the financial aid process, or to implement a financial literacy program that was meaningful and impactful for our students. But the majority of the resources in my office are spent administering federal financial aid. The rules and regulations are so laborious and labor intensive and at times illogical and conflicting. So Senator Begich, do you see any possibility in the future of looking at the rules and regulations surrounding Title IV administration and making them perhaps less labor intensive and with the ultimate impact of being more student-friendly.
First, let me say one thing. When I graduated from high school, it was required a quarter credit in personal finance. It's not required anymore, which I think is a huge mistake. I mean, I spend, my 11-year-old, I spend a lot of time with him. Matter of fact, we were just talking about scholarships. He was talking about his grades, and I said, well, if you don't do so well, you're not getting scholarships, so that money you're putting aside is going to have to pay for college. So now he has an economic incentive to do well, and he's getting it. He's doing the math, and actually, I came home from one of my trips, and I looked on the kitchen table, and I said, what's all this stuff? He says, well, this is stuff I'm going to put on eBay to sell. I said, well, what are you talking about? He says, well, I don't need it anymore, and I need to put some money away for college, but if I get my scholarships, then I'll have it for later. And I thought, okay, whatever works, whatever the motivation is. So that is one piece that I think we have to fix, the literacy issue, because when it comes to financial literacy in this country, because there are so many things that are now out there, more complex than ever before. Now, in regards to regulation, I think the simple answer is yes, because there's some work being done now in the Health, Education, Labor, Pension Committee, long title, but it's basically the committee in the Senate deals with education. There's a couple pieces. One is private school, nonprofit schools, or for-profit schools issue, nonprofit schools, universities, and then the bigger question is how do these loan programs, which we literally in the last couple of years, as you know, we've changed the way we've done them, but now we're getting, just as you've just described, a lot of complaints on can't you streamline this so it's simpler for the universities, the colleges, the career education programs to move through them quicker? And I think the answer is yes, but we're a little ways away, to be frank with you, because we took the first challenge of bringing them in-house, because the banks, we were just talking about in Canada, it's different. And the way you described it, I think the Canada, the banks do it all. But in our system here, right, see, we couldn't control the rate, and the banks were making a lot of money and high rates, and so what we've tried to do now is bring it in-house, but the regulatory piece is absolutely next. And I'd be interested in make sure, hopefully at the end of this, I would love to hear some of your ideas that we could look at, because there are crazy rules we put into place that layer on top of other rules, and then later people find out, why did we do that first rule? No one even knows. So I'd be very anxious for any ideas that you have, and we'll make sure at the end here we get some from you. Thanks.
Thank you for the question. Next question, we have a few hands over here. And I'll just plug that we do have materials in the back from some of the panelists, and we also have a sign-up sheet in the front if you'd like to keep in touch with Senator Begich and express your comments.
Yeah, just a little different perspective on it. I graduated from the University of Maryland in the early 70s, and credits then were $100 a credit. I don't think you'll find that anyplace else. And I guess the question is, the University of Maryland in Maryland realized that education was important, and so there was a heavy subsidy of the universities. Nationally, there was like about 2/3 of the funds for state universities came from the state. We've got a much lower rate now, and that money's being shifted over to the individual. So at this point, we have nursing students who are waiting a year or so to get into nursing programs, and suddenly the shift came over to the student being a cost. And I'm going to put a sort of a, make a little leap and follow with me. If we turn back the tax giveaway that the governor passed, how much money would that make available to places for university or high schools or preschools, so that we wouldn't have to have kids take 5 years to go through college because they're not prepared, and that they could go through college and not have to work a second job because the state would have enough money to support the university for the future of the state?
Well, let me
It depends who you ask on the last part of that question. Maybe the university can talk about tuition, but I will say this, Gordon, that you know, this is just, I'll just say this general statement and stop on this one, and that is the greatest equalizer in this country is education. It doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, the capacity to access education. And the challenge we have now is as you move through K through 12 with public education, the access is fantastic. But as you move higher up, because of economics, we're starting to shrink the capacity. And what makes us a great nation, a great state, is education. It is the fundamental opportunity that people can get and explore anything they want. There's countries that, people from other countries that would starve to have what we have here. but by the economics, we're shrinking it and tightening it to the point where we're thinking about today's budgets, but we're not looking 10 years out. Very dangerous, I think. And so I gave my lecture to the legislature 2 weeks ago. I'm not sure I'll be invited back, but they heard my 2 bits on education.
Thank you. Dr. Ryan, could you talk about state funding of education and then actually going through school in 4 years?
Well, like Gordon, I worked my way through school. I was a telephone operator, you guys, and I'd work overnight shift, and I did just fine paying my tuition, so I came out with hardly any student loans. But I do believe that there's 2 or 3 stages here we're talking about. One of the things for sure is we have to have people better financially prepared to take responsibility for their own lives. I agree with you entirely on that. There should be high school courses that are mandatory. Like I don't know why in a world where we hand out credit cards like tissue paper, no, that's a real concern. I mean, the fact that they have to have differential loans, that they have to take second, it's like having a second and third mortgage on your home. I mean, but yet if you manage it properly, the investment you make in your education will be the cheapest and best money you'll ever spend. But I think that one of the difficulties that we're facing is that, and I want to tell Gordon something, I pulled out the figures while he was talking. The lower division cost for tuition at UAA right now is $174 a credit. So how many years ago was that you did that, Gordon? That's a long time ago. That isn't as big a change as you thought, right? But of course now we have a lot of other fees that get added in too, like distance education fees and so on. But there are ways, I think, that we can seriously look at cutting back fees. When I told you the story about the MAT, the Master of Arts in Teaching versus the postbac will cost the student just jockey's change under $4,000 less. So there are ways that we can go after individual things and reduce those fees, because it's an investment, and you should pursue your passion. You just don't want to look and say, oh, well, I know actuaries are the best paid profession in the world. I think I'll be an actuary if you hate math, right? So, I mean, for gosh sakes, pursue your passion, because it's a quality of life that you pursue, but you also can't come out owing hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Tracy, could you respond from APU's perspective?
Sure, I appreciate the opportunity to. One of the things that's interesting for Alaska Pacific University is actually the state regulations which don't allow the state to provide any money for private higher ed. Some states, they can. Legislative situation is such that a state can provide some money to a private institution as well as to the state institution. But across the country, I think you wisely note that most states are having to constrict what they're able to subsidize for public and private higher education. And I think Alaska's been very fortunate in the amount of money that the legislature has been able to put towards supporting the UA system and keeping the tuition down. It really is quite admirable, but it's changing. One of the things that we try to do is, like I said before, address the difference between what we charge in tuition with private fundraising and donations and with revenue that we get from endowment properties. But I want to add one thing that I didn't hear very much of, which is, in addition to teaching students financial literacy and responsibility, I was thinking about the Alaska loans, which I got to go to college a couple of years ago. And when I came back, we're just going to stop there. But at the time, the program was such, I think they were trying to encourage people who went outside for education to return. And so I actually was in the era when half of my loan was forgiven by returning to the state and working for a number of years. Yeah, it was a great program, and it was definitely a piece of what got me back to the state and has kept me in the state. I actually got a Stafford loan for a second degree after I got my doctorate, and I'm still paying that one off. But the state loan was amazing for my undergraduate and my doctorate degree. That was part of what got me back here. So, rethinking those possibilities as well. But the thing that students also don't like to do is fill out applications for scholarships. And there are lots of them, and some of them are very large, supported by like Native corporations here, other ones, but there's really funky little ones that I'm joking, but I think we have one that's like for blue-eyed Texans from east of a certain line. So but we have very unique specialized ones, Scandinavians whose parents were born in, Finland. I mean, there's very unique ones where donors have some special interest in an institution and helping students think about being creative, looking for those, because those you don't pay back. You just have to fill out the paperwork to apply for them. So that's part of what we're trying to do to make up the difference in affordability.
Can I just make one quick, because I think your point, you probably were itching to do this, and so I'll add, and you can feel free to add to it, and that is, the reason the forgiveness loan program ended, I was there during that time in the post-secondary education loan, was because two things. One, there was no real data that showed us the recovery rate of people coming back, which is very interesting. They were coming back, but not like it was anticipated. But second, because the Student Loan Corporation is funded through bonds that they have to sell on the market. In the old days, the state would put money in, then they stopped. And so what happened is state, and I remember this with legislators, they loved talking about the free program, but they never wanted to put a dime to it. So so this commission was always in this dilemma. They were losing money on these loans as quickly as they were going because the state no longer funded them, because just what you said, Gordon, they gave up. The state just walked away from their commitment of that program. Now, saying that on the federal level, one thing we did in the Affordable Care Act was a loan provision that I put in there was for people who go in what we call high need areas. It's now $100,000, used to be 50, now it's $100,000 that we will forgive, the federal government will forgive in loans as long as you work 2 years in an area that is in this list. This is the right kind of mix of the policy. We did not have that when that student loan program was around. So by just coming back to work was great, except one, we didn't have income tax, we didn't have sales tax, we didn't have, so it didn't generate what people thought. But on the flip side, if you do these right, like the 100,000, when I increased that, and now it's law, we know we can put people into areas that we are in desperate need for health care in certain categories. It actually benefits back to the university and the teachers. The last thing I'll mention on this, one thing we've done in the last year, which directly affects the university and colleges, and that is the National Institute of Health. By putting money back into that institute, which has been going the wrong direction, all our research we've done on the federal land partners with universities across the country and actually helps prepare and expand programs. When we were cutting that, and not me, but some of my colleagues, because their attitude was, well, we don't need that research. Well, yeah, you do, because if you look at the great research we've done on healthcare or technology or whatever, it's driven by universities. And our partnership is critical, and then what you end up with is these great student interns working in these programs, getting an incredible education, real practical experience.
Thank you, Senator Begich. And yes, I could comment on the Alaska education loans, and congratulations on earning the forgiveness. As Senator Begich, yes, as Senator Begich pointed out, that program didn't quite have the return that the Alaska legislature at the time, I'm sure, was hoping for. And Senator Begich, you may be pleased to know that I believe you were asking for it at the time, but we actually did just recently, I don't know how many years later, release a report that does detail, and by recently, I think it was about a week ago. a little bit of a delay there. I'm sorry. So the obviously for those students who benefited from the forgivable loans, that was an incredible benefit. But one thing that we did find was many students took out those loans with the expectation that it would be forgiven and weren't looking at it as a loan. So you had students who not only didn't qualify, but they were then unable to repay, which had other negative implications on them. As Senator Begich mentioned, from that point forward, really, and to the current point in time, the Alaska supplemental education loans are funded through the issuance of bonds. So they're supported by the market. They don't come at an extra cost to the state. The state loans, of course, we still do have initiatives to promote things like Alaska Presence. Right now, students who live in Alaska, after they complete their education and they enter repayment, can qualify for a 0.5% discount on their loans. There is also an initiative going on right now, actually, Senate Joint Resolution 23 just passed this morning from the Senate Education Committee here in the Alaska State Legislature to state finance, so it's weaving its way through the process. But it is actually a constitutional amendment that would allow future Alaska education loans to be financed through general obligation bonds of the state of Alaska. So that would be a fairly substantial change to the ability of the Student Loan Corporation in terms of the interest rate that could be offered on those loans. It would be a multi-year process. There would be some there would actually be 2 stages when this would be on the ballot here for general election, something that you may see at some point in the future, depending on how this legislation moves forward. But it would actually allow a reduction of at least, most likely 1% in interest rates compared to what the Student Loan Corporation can do on its own. So there are initiatives going on to try to lower the rates of supplemental education loans that are available through the state of Alaska. At no cost to the state. That's always one of those important things to balance, is the cost to taxpayers or to the state in general, but certainly trying to ensure that students have access to education, which is, as Senator Begich said, the great equalizer. And that includes financial aid in many different forms, including reasonably priced education loans.
Thank you. So we have about 15 minutes left and a few hands up in the back.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. We're going to rotate around. Could we get the back first so we can just make sure to cover everyone, and then we'll get back to you?
So while it makes sense to talk about financial responsibility and living frugally as a student, all of those things make sense. But it's true that the price of higher education has far outpaced the inflation rate. The Consumer Price Index since 1980 till now has increased about 120%. And the cost of 1 year at a 4-year institution has increased almost 600% over that same time period. Wouldn't it make sense to restrict the growth of tuition cost to CPI to keep it at closer to the inflation rate?
Good question. So I'll direct that to our institutions here. What are you guys doing to keep the upfront cost of education down and tuition down?
I think your question is a very fair one, and I think one of the things that, I don't understand all of the factors that have led to the cost of education outstripping the CPI. I think it will be easier potentially for state-supported or institutions to get some form of state support to keep their tuition closer to the CPI than it will be for privates. I know that, I can't speak for the UA system, but what we're trying to do at APU is bring every amount of efficiency we can into our operations, making reductions of unnecessary functions eliminated, trying to really relook at our degrees and make sure that we're offering degrees that do lead to job possibilities that are much clearer and much more likely for students, and shortening the time to completion. So, we're trying to bring down the cost of tuition. That's part of our reset, and trying to understand better the true costs of education. I know that I've read around the country that part of what's caused some of these inflations is things that I will tell you we don't have, and I don't know that our colleagues next door have, climbing walls, highly wired buildings. There is a sort of boutique quality and expectation that students today have of higher education institutions that weren't around when I was going to school. So it's hard to know how much student champagne tastes, and the institutions attempting to meet those tastes have contributed to us outstripping the CPI, but I think addressing those things will help as well.
Yes, I found it interesting that the CPI has changed to that low relative to the cost of education, because I don't think that the cost of UAA's tuition has certainly climbed 600% in the time that you're speaking of. But one of the things that interests me is that the state has, for some reason, I presume Mark may speak to it, has reduced the amount of its contributions over time. Now, I'm assuming that oil and gas and mining have not deteriorated that badly that the amount of money being committed is reduced. I'm surprised to hear you say that the thing has climbed 600%.
Well, I think that's a national
yes,
statistic.
I mean, I heard on NPR one morning, just about fell off my little 6 o'clock feet, that Harvard's first year, I believe it was Harvard, is $56,000 tuition. If that is true for a freshman first year, somebody should be looking at some sort of an explanation for the Ivy League system, because I come from a system that's fairly different than that, so I don't understand it. But perhaps somebody could tell me that it's worth that kind of difference.
Well, I think, when I was at UAA, we were facing 22% tuition increases over 2 years, and I think, tuition has gone up. Are there any specific things that UAA is doing to address those tuition increases?
Well, I don't think anyone is discussing raising any tuition fees. I sit at deans and directors every couple of weeks, and I certainly know that we are trying to cut back and find ways to use efficiencies in the operation to save money rather than do anything to affect fees. And I've actually looking at the fees for this university coming in as I did as an outsider, and I do not see them as being disproportionately high. But if we're talking the southern states, then I would be worried.
Thank you. Next question. In the back.
So I have student loan debts, and just listening to the conversations about financial literacy, I wish I could encourage everybody to do that more. I think had somebody really been there when I was going to school, it would have saved me from not choosing federal debt and instead getting private loan debt. It's just been something that's affected me on a daily basis, and I just wish there was.
Thank you. Response?
I think that we're all saying the same thing here on this issue, and that is, financial literacy or understanding what the obligation that you have when you take out a student loan. You may not realize in that first year, second year, third year, even the fourth year, but later down the road when you suddenly get the bill, which will come very quickly, you realize the economic piece of this puzzle. So you have multiple pieces to this again, and we've heard it a little bit here today. One is, what can universities do to control their costs and tuition? What can governments do that are in the loaning business, maybe the state or the federal, making sure that we keep the rates as low as possible? I mean, I know people say you're saying it too simplistically, but when my mother can get a car, which she just got 2 weeks ago, at 1.9%, 1.9%, in some cases zero, for a piece of equipment, the minute you drive it off the lot, it's worth less than you just paid for it 15 minutes before, is amazing to me. I mean, and so we have to reshape our policies on the financing end as universities look at their restructuring, because you're right, I forget the data point of the top 5 Ivy League schools, but when you look at their endowments that they have and what they can do with that endowment to make sure people can afford education rather than $56,000 a year is unbelievable what they can do. But they choose not to. They make a prioritization. And so and then the third piece is really in a state like ours, which is not a poor state, to invest in offsetting the cost of education in the sense of the capital improvements that the schools need, or figuring out how to lower the cost is very important. And then the last is what was mentioned about, you come back, you get a career in the state, you get a lower interest rate. Those are pieces to the puzzle. But one by themselves won't work. You have to have this combo.
Tracy?
And if I might add, financial literacy is a piece of it, but I think we have to remember that there are true costs to provide education. And we've actually had troubles in the last couple of years where students refuse federal loans and expect to be able to get an education for literally nothing or what they can put together. And we have grants, we have scholarships, we work very hard with students to round out and make college affordable. But again, that's the flip side of college literacy. It costs something, and while I would never want a student to be turned away from APU if they wanted to attend and it was the education that met their needs, I think it's also important to work with parents to help students not only identify what they want to do and what their career path is going to be, but what form of college is affordable. Because my colleagues at UAA have a great education, and I think that students would do very well at UAA. I think they would do very well at APU, and if we can help them afford it, that's great. But our costs are different, and so we do everything we can to keep them down. It's parental jobs, school counselors, colleagues and friends that help students pick schools that they can also afford.
Yep. We have about 6 minutes left.
We have time for one last question.
Okay.
Hi, my name's Lupe Mariquin, and so we're really focusing on this college, the fees. I mean, it's tragic that we have a group of students who've had to encumber enormous debt, and they can't get their head above water to be a productive member of society and get moving forward and help to build our future. So we have, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name, but from APU, we have UAA, we have a financial counselor, we have our senator here. What are we going to do about this problem? I mean, we're talking about it, we've got on this end, and then we have students who have this terrible debt. We need to help them get out of that debt. We need to put something in place now and quickly so that we can get these people free of this awful debt that they're carrying. I mean, my daughter-in-law is one of those people who has one of those terrible loans, and you know, financial education for people, yes, financial responsibility, yes, that's all great and good, but I didn't know that stuff when I was going through college. I just kind of applied for what I needed to get and went forward and paid it off. But we're having a problem here, and we need to fix it. How are we going to do that?
So let's do 20 seconds each, a rapid-fire response to what's being done.
Two bills.
Current student debt.
Yeah, two bills that are pending. One is, as I mentioned, Senator Gillibrand has, which allows refinancing of federal debt, and the one that we're working on with Senator Warren will give capacity to refinance any student loan debt, private or federal or state, at a rate of 4%, which is huge savings between what they're paying today in a fixed rate and based on their income.
At the state level, in addition to the legislation that I just mentioned that would lower student loan rates for supplemental rates in the future, there's another piece of legislation, Senate Bill 195, that's looking at creating an opportunity for the Student Loan Corporation to offer consolidation loans that would potentially create options for people who did get into those high interest or variable rate loans offered by private lenders, potentially venues to pursue something that would be more manageable in the future.
And for us, I think we have two obligations. One is to continue to reduce tuition as much as we can while still covering the cost of education, and increase endowment funds so that we can provide scholarships for students that aren't required to be repaid, so that it goes into the mix of what they owe, reducing their overall debt.
Along that same line, we have this year really expanded our advising office, and I'm going to go back out of here more sensitized, thanks to all of you, and say that I would like our student advisors, who are pretty capable, and one comes from Fairbanks, we've got people who've got a fair range of experience in this state working for us, to really warn students coming in our freshman year, and I'll make sure I'll say it in my first delivery to them, about the importance of being very careful about the kinds of expenditures that, or expenses that they take on during their 3 or 4 years at university.
Thank you. Well, that concludes today's one-course discourse. I want to thank our panelists, Tracy Stewart, Academic Dean of APU. We have Dr. Heather Ryan, Dean of the College of Education at UAA. Rebecca Matrasova, Director in Outreach and Early Awareness at Alaska Commission for Postsecondary Education. And our U.S. Senator Mark Begich for joining us today. Let's give him a round of applause. And again, I encourage folks to check out the materials in the back of the room. There's a sign-up sheet in the back. And if everyone could join me in thanking the Beartooth for hosting this event as well. Stay tuned for the next one-course discourse event. It will be posted on the Beartooth Facebook.